Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first ever Matt Hatter Show. We're going to break down the latest news and information for you for the upcoming election for 2024. So, got some good news for you. If you are a fan of Trump, then you're going to want to take a look at this. So, Trump now leads in the polling averages by about 4/10 of a point. Now, why is that significant? Well, because the latest poll that dropped today from Atlas Intel shows Trump has a 2-point lead now over his rival, Kamala Harris, at 48%. To Trump's 50%. Excuse me. There is a 2-point margin of error here. 3,032 likely voters. That's really, really good. Strong showing for Trump there in this poll at least. +2 for him with a low margin of error. So overall, 0.4 or 4/10 of a point lead over Harris. Now, this is in the national election, or I should say in the popular vote. Now, this does not mean that Trump is going to win the popular vote. It just means that if the election were held today based upon the composition of this poll, there would be a decent chance that he would end up winning about 50% of the votes versus Harris's 48%. With the remaining 2% going to other candidates. So let's break this down and see how this kind of plays out. So if we look back over the course of the last month, there's no doubt that things have started to drift and trend more in Trump's direction. Starting around the middle of October, and if we can look back on our graph here, we can really begin to see the point where the Harris campaign kind of peaked early to mid-October. 49%, give or take. That's basically where she'd been kind of treading water at. Just couldn't seem to break through that wall, if you will, around the 49% point. And then ever since about the middle of October, it's just fallen off a cliff. And I think that's just been where a lot of Harris voters, they just can't do it. They just cannot commit to 4 more years of what it is that we are seeing right now. She certainly has alienated a lot of her supporters. And her latest messaging of just kind of like attack Trump, call him Hitler, and then run away from the press and not do any type of an interview with anybody who might be in the least bit hostile, towards her. Even going so far as to be unable to sit down for more than 20 minutes with someone like a Brett Baier from Fox News, which is certainly he is certainly not the most antagonistic of reporters. He does a good job. He's pretty fair and even-handed in terms of his interview style. Yet she's got time to sit with podcasts that are favorable already towards her and towards her message, and she can sit down with one of them for an hour or more. Joe Rogan, of course. Trump went on the Joe Rogan experience here recently. Had a great showing there. I loved the interview. I thought he did a phenomenal job, just really kind of sitting down and just chatting. I mean, it was like watching two guys just sit on the front porch over a glass of iced tea or whatever, and just have a good time talking. It really was that relaxed, and I really liked that. And at the same time, though, Joe Rogan's got this air about him, this natural ability as an interviewer to just kind of pull information out without coming across in a overtly hostile manner. So there were a few times whenever Trump wanted to wander off some of his answers, and Joe was able to pull him back in and did a great job there. So really, really good podcast. Loved it. Kamala Harris, she was offered the chance and basically declined. In a manner of speaking, she said that Joe, you can come to me, and Joe's like, that's not how it works. It's my show, and it would be a lot better if you went to the studio where we have all of the equipment, everything set up to do the podcast from. And she, of course, declined. And I can't blame her. Honestly, I don't think it would have gone very well for her if she had gone on there. I think that it would have turned out pretty bad. Truthfully, not necessarily because that Rogan would have been hostile towards her. I just don't think she can keep up that facade for very long in a setting that is not super warm and welcoming to her. So, anyways, moving along a little bit here, let's dive into the polls. So, if we were to look at things right now, so there were some movements today on the electoral map. Before I get to that, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. This is our first ever event here with the Matt Hatter Show, and this is not going to be the normal format, but we are in the process of getting things set up, and until we do it, until we get everything done, I'm going to have to go this route. So, but don't worry, we'll have everything set up, and before long, you will be able to see my lovely smiling face. So, anyways, Arizona. This is the first one in the list of battleground states that Trump needs to win to be able to cement his victory next week. If he doesn't win Arizona, it becomes very, very difficult. He can still win, but it does become a little bit more difficult. The biggest concern that I would have here is, of course, if he did not win, then it would not. It would indicate a change in a trajectory, a headwind here that would probably spill over into other states. So, with that said, if he does win here, it does improve his odds, I think, across the board, perhaps in areas like Nevada, maybe. So, Atlas Intel released a new poll today, which has Trump ahead by 4. Now, that is by far the best poll that Trump has had since the New York Times poll back on the early part of October, October 10th. That was the 7th through the 10th for that poll. The difference between the two is that the poll here from early October only had about 808 likely voters, showing Trump ahead by 5, and there was a high margin of error. This one had almost twice that, 1,458, with a 3-point margin of error, and it shows Trump ahead by 4. That's strong. Now, compare and contrast that to something like the CNN poll, which only has Harris ahead by 1, and that is the best poll that she has had in a month in Arizona. The odds of her picking up Arizona at this point, based on the polling, are low. I would say at this point, Trump has a probably better than 70% chance of taking the state of Arizona if the trend continues and if everyone shows up to vote. This is important. Polls do not win elections. Votes do. So please, if you haven't already, get out and vote. Now, another good news here is that this poll also has him breaking that critical threshold of 50%. So he actually leads here 51 to 47. That's a very strong indication that the state is trending. Trending is the operative word here, in his direction. If we go back here early in October, 51, 51. So we had a couple of good polls here from not necessarily the most Trump-friendly sources, CBS News and New York Times. If we look back this day in history, 2020, it was tied, and yet Biden ended up winning the state by 0.3 of a point. Now, he was leading in the RCP average by 0.9 of a point, so there was a slight trend here that did favor Trump by 0.6 of a point. I would not say that just because Biden carried the state by only 0.3 of a point, and that Trump overcome, if you will, 0.6 of a point of polling error to be able to kind of like closely almost match him, just because that happened before does not necessarily mean that we need to add 0.6 of a point to this here. Don't make that mistake. There are a lot of people, a lot of YouTube channels right now popping up saying, hey, it's great, sunshine and rainbows, happy days are here again, Trump's going to win this, he's got in the bag. Don't make that mistake, folks. All right, get out, vote. If you like Trump, if you want to change the direction of this country, get your butt to the polls. So, right now, very positive. Good news for Trump. I don't want to sound negative here. Don't want to take a negative or a positive and turn it into a negative. But again, unless the votes materialize, then this doesn't happen. So again, get out and vote. Moving along, Nevada. Nevada is another one of these states that Trump technically does not have to win the election. But it does make it just a little bit easier, and it gives him some margin and cushion. So if one of these other states doesn't go his way, it can help. Now, Atlas Intel, another poll was released today out of Nevada. This one shows Trump ahead by 1 point. 1 point. That's not big, but it's pretty decent. Now, if we look back on this day in history, Biden was leading by 2.4. So Biden, or he was leading by 4, actually, according to this day in history. But in terms of the RCP average at the end of the election cycle, 2.4, and he won by 2.4. So this could very well end up materializing. Trump could end up leading or winning this thing, and if so, it would be the first time that a Republican candidate has carried the state of Nevada since 2004, in 20 years. And that was for the re-election of George W. Bush, and that was post 9/11, and that was against a horrible Democratic candidate, John Kerry. So, regardless how you feel about Bush or Kerry, Kerry was a horrible candidate. Digress. Anyways, so you have to go back 20 years to find an instance where a Republican candidate carried the state of Nevada. So the fact that Trump even stands a chance of carrying Nevada right now is unto itself, I think, a bellwether and an indication that things are trending very positively for Donald Trump. Now, let's move along because we got more to cover here and not a lot of time. Wisconsin, Trump is now ahead by 0.6 of a point. Atlas Intel, again, reliable pollster, tie. Just because you're seeing the RCP average here at 0.6, don't think that's a guarantee. Again, reliable pollster, 3-point margin of error, and they're showing it with the tie. Some of these other polls here showing Trump ahead. Barely, very barely, okay? I mean, I can't stress that enough. Biden, this day in history, was leading by 6.7. He actually, his RCP average was 6.7, but he only carried the state by 0.7 of a point. So Trump outperformed all of the polls. Now, just because some of these polls had Trump losing so badly and probably had mixed into their polling methodologies some oversampling biases, that does not mean that we should assume that this same thing is going to happen again. Don't make the mistake of assuming that, hey, there's probably 6 percentage points of movement here that are going to benefit Trump in the last minute when people go into the voting booth to cast their ballot. Yes, there are silent Trump voters, people who will not admit to publicly voting for Trump but will do so behind closed doors. As we learned from the Al Smith dinner here recently, we call them Biden families, the Biden family. So anyways, and probably some of the Harris family too, but I digress. So anyways, at this point, it's entirely possible that Trump can pull ahead slightly as we move towards Election Day. If so, that would be great. I would say that it's probably going to be deadlocked all the way up to election. I don't see this moving a lot. The reason is that even the Republican pollster here, October 20th, whenever this poll was released roughly, decent margin of error, had it at a tie. So if a Republican pollster is showing this as a tie, I don't see this moving, this is significantly moving one way or the other in the next few days, then in the next week. It hasn't moved much since early October. All right? Going back here on the trend line, yes, it has become more favorable towards Trump, but since Trump took the lead, it hasn't really moved a whole lot. Yep, a little bit, but pretty well treading water. So that means Trump's momentum still there, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee a win. Most of his momentum has been because the Harris campaign has just been in a free fall. Ever since really around the Al Smith dinner, oddly enough. That's about I would hate to say that ends up being what cost her the election, but who knows? The last time that a candidate snubbed the dinner was Walter Mondale in 1984, and I could show you the election map for that year. It was not pretty for Democrats. So anyways, let's move along here from Wisconsin to Michigan. Michigan, this one here, Atlas Intel, new poll released today, Trump ahead by 1. So we have Trump ahead by 1 here, an Insider Advantage poll ahead by 1, Emerson Group ahead by 1. There are some polls here that I do question. I do question the Susquehanna poll. It has a very low sample size and a very high margin of error. I would not put much stock in this, and I'll be honest with you on that one here. Biden, this day in history, carried it by 8.2. His average did collapse going into the final stretch of the election, and collapsed even further on election day itself. So 4.2, 2.8, again, perhaps some shift towards Trump at the very end. That perhaps is an indication of what's happening here in this poll that occurred late in the game 4 years ago. Perhaps a little bit of sampling bias here. Again, Republican pollster. Republican pollsters tend to do what Democratic pollsters do. As you can see down here, CNBC, Jane's Research, Democratic pollster. Glad they put these little indicators on here. They do help. Had Biden leading by 7. That didn't happen. Emerson also had him up by 7. Mitchell Research had him up by 7. Insider Advantage had him up by 2. So all of these basically were oversampling the Democrats, and in the end, it actually did not help Biden necessarily. It actually ended up, costing him maybe about 2 points or 1.5. But there's no way of knowing for sure, to be honest. We can just say for certain that Trump picked up a little bit of steam going into the closing round on election day. Clinton, 2016, we had RCP average of 3.6 to her advantage. Trump, 0.3. So again, he picked up 3.9 percentage points in the at the election itself. So going into the closing days of the election, right now he's leading. That's really good. I'm glad to see it. Better than being behind. But again, if people don't get out and vote, Wisconsin, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. I was on Michigan, I thought. Yeah, it was. Sorry. In this case here, Harris leading slightly. But 0.5, still within the margin of error. So no matter how you look at this, 3 percentage points for the margin of error. Rasmussen on a tie. The highest on the actual margin of error, Susquehanna, almost 5. Harris by 5. So you take that margin of error, and basically you're back to a tie again, which is, again, what we're seeing really in these polls. So even though the average has Harris up barely, I wouldn't put any, if I were the Harris campaign, I would not be celebrating today on this one, I have to admit, especially given that the most recent 3 polls all show Trump ahead slightly. Now, none of these 3 polls conducted, really the reliable polls conducted in the last week, have either of these candidates crossing the 50% point. All right, no matter which side you're on, the best Trump's got here is 49%. Now over here we do have, again, a relatively recent poll. I don't trust this one. I got to be real. 4.9, and again, 5% points here. This one here, 4, 2.9. Decent sample size, I will say that. Don't have a whole lot against Quinnipiac, but at the same time, whenever you're dealing with all these other polls that are kind of screaming at you, I question outliers like this. I really do. So I would say that this is really within 1 point margin right now. So 1 point to Trump, 1 point to Harris, somewhere in the range. So I would say it's really tied in Michigan. They got to give it to somebody right now. So I can see why they've done that here for Harris. Pennsylvania, next one up. Trump ahead, ever so slightly here. CBS News released a poll. Looks like today, tie. Atlas Intel, 3 points for Trump. Insider Advantage, 1 point. AM Greatness, NSOR, I guess that's what they, maybe a radio station? I don't know. I have no idea who that is. Tie. Emerson Trump by 1. And then, of course, kind of go back in time a little bit further. For Trump, the benefit here is that 6 of these polls have him leading versus Harris. She's only showing leading in 3 of these polls. 2 of them reflect ties. Right now, again, this is probably within a point either way. Going back in time, Biden was up by 4.3 and Clinton was up by 5. On election day, whenever the votes were tallied, RCP average, Biden ended up only winning by 1.2. So we know that the polls could essentially drift, and they will. They will drift. How much they drift, who knows? 2016 had a 3-way or 4-way race with Trump, Clinton, Johnson, and Stein. that year, and the RCP average was 1.9, and more people pushed the proverbial button or lever for Trump to win, and so he eked out a narrow victory, 7/10 of a point, but still enough to cement him into the White House in 2016. So it's possible the same thing can happen yet here again. What I don't want you to do is think, hey, he's up, so that's good. It means he's going to win. No, folks, get out, get your vote in. That's what matters. Moving down, North Carolina, Atlas Intel. They got Harris up by 1. Not good for Trump because, again, they're a pretty reliable pollster. But still, neither one of these candidates have crossed that proverbial 50% point, 50% margin right now, or actual the vote. Trafalgar, that's probably helping Trump a little bit here in this one by 3. Decent sample size, 1,091, 2.9 margin of error. Still puts them back basically around a tie. This one here, 1,665 likely voters, has them up by, has a margin of error of 3, plus 1 here, so who knows? Plus 2 for Trump, plus 1 for Harris, anywhere in that range is completely possible right now. Some of these other polls, looking back in time here, we've got about 6 polls that are favoring Trump, 2 polls that are favoring Harris, and 3 that are ties. So Trump still up by 1. I would call this one too close to call. I just have to be real with you folks. There's a lot going on in North Carolina. They had a bad hurricane that hit them a month ago, and I have no idea how that's going to ultimately pan out when it comes to affecting people showing up to vote. If you lost everything that you have, I don't think coming out to vote is going to be a whole lot on your immediate priority list in terms of priority. So I think that you got to bear that in mind and place that into consideration there. We'll see. Meanwhile, looking back in time, Biden was leading on this day in history by 0.6 of a point. We know that Trump ultimately did win the state, and he carried it by 1.3. The RCP average did move in his direction, largely overcoming probably some sampling biases that were occurring in some of these other polls. Rasmussen had him by 1 in the closing stretch of the election, and sure enough, 1.3. Now, it'd be interesting to see another Rasmussen poll here, along with the most recent one we have is way back here, and that's on the 14th of November, or excuse me, of October, with Rasmussen, and that was Trump by 5. And that one I really would question. I have to admit that one would be aging off here at some point, being probably replaced by a newer one, and then we can get a little bit better idea if this thing is still trending in Trump's direction. I would say no matter what ends up happening, it's still going to be close. In this state, it's just a matter of who ultimately ends up being able to get their voters out. We do know also for North Carolina that Harris did pull out some of her spending. Now that could be for one of 2 reasons. So it could be because she thinks the handwriting is on the wall and that the odds of her winning the state of North Carolina are low, and therefore she's not going to invest a whole lot of resources in the state of North Carolina. However, it's entirely possible that the opposite is true too, and that she has seen internal polling which indicates it's a safe state at this point, and they don't have to worry about spending in North Carolina, that it's in the bag. So just because someone pulls out and pulls their money into a different direction does not necessarily mean that that they have abandoned that state. So don't think that. There could be two reasonable explanations to explain why a particular action here is being done. Don't know what the situation is like again throughout a lot of the state. Time will tell. We'll see. We'll know on election day. Meanwhile, if we were to move down to the state of Georgia, and that is the other swing state, and perhaps one of the ones that I do feel a little bit more confident about today than I did yesterday. Atlas Intel, even Bloomberg, Insider Advantage, Quinnipiac, all of these showing Trump ahead. So I don't really believe that Trump is going to lose Georgia. 2016, Trump was ahead by 4.8, and he carried the state by 5.1. If we go back to 2020, of course, Biden, he was showing ahead by 0.4. RCP average on election had Trump ahead by 1. Biden won by 0.3. So it was very close, very tight. So I would say this point, yeah, I'm feeling pretty confident right now for what I'm seeing here in Georgia. at least as it relates to what we're seeing for the election currently. Now, in terms of the election map itself, so if we look at the electoral map, if we were to look at everything right now that has kind of been placed into the different categories between safe and leaning, RCP average is essentially tracking that the Trump Vance ticket has about 219 to 215 for Harris, and 104 electoral votes are on the toss-up side. And if we go over to create our own map, where you can actually, and I'm going to go ahead and go ahead and examine these right now. We'll just push these into the toss-up category, which is honestly where they really are at. Oops, excuse me. As it stands right now, these are the states that really are the ones that are going to decide this election. Now, that sucks for everybody else because, hey, we still got to get out and vote, but the reality is that, these 7 states are the ones that are getting the largest amount of attention, primarily up here and I would say here. Arizona, I would say at this point, it's pretty well a safe bet. Not safe, 70% likelihood that Arizona goes into Donald Trump's column. I would say the same thing at this point for Georgia. It puts Trump up to 246 electoral votes. However, that's not 270. So he has to win some combination of these states. Nevada won't do it. Yes, it would be a nice star in the crown, so to speak. It would be a nice thing to have, but it's not going to decide the election. I do believe that everyone in Nevada needs to get out and vote. Trump voters, get mobilized, get out there and make your voice heard by all means, because it does make things a little bit easier here, and I'll show you why in just a second. So let's imagine for a moment that things did go well for Trump here in Nevada. That puts him up to 252 electoral votes. But what about these other 4 states here? See, North Carolina, if he gets North Carolina, he's still shy by 2 electoral votes. That doesn't do it for him. And there is a slight chance that this could happen, which really, really sucks, I have to admit. But unfortunately, Mark Robinson's campaign here in North Carolina is not helping Trump. It's hurting him. And if it were any other election year, I would say this is probably going to be a safe bet. But I have to admit, this is going to be a problem. No doubt Trump's helping Robinson somewhat, but I can't say how much, nor can I say how much that Robinson's hurting Trump. But if I had to guess, I would say that Robinson is hurting Trump more than Trump is helping Robinson right now. But I don't know for sure. We'll see. Time will tell. Let's hope I'm wrong. Let's hope that it does go into the Trump column. But let's imagine for a moment that this happens. At this point, now one of these other states become must win. So if he wins Nevada and he picks up Pennsylvania, boom, it's over. He's won. Regardless of what happens here in Michigan and Wisconsin, at that point, Nevada becomes crucial towards Trump, because even if these go into the Democratic column, 267 to 271, Trump wins. It's all over. So then we can celebrate. But if he doesn't pick up Nevada, then the entire map changes. 273, Harris, 265, and it all hinged here on North Carolina, even though Trump was able to win Pennsylvania. Okay, and that's a biggie with 19 electoral votes. So this is why Nevada becomes so important to Trump right now, because it kind of acts as a bit of a firewall against losing North Carolina. And if you still have done all this work to pick up one of these Rust Belt states, you still are able to eke out a narrow victory. Now, the problem here is that what happens if he doesn't win Pennsylvania? He loses. He would need to win both of these 2 states, Wisconsin and Michigan, to be able to win. That becomes a lot more difficult by losing Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, again, it's leaning in his direction right now. North Carolina leaning in his direction. The best outcome, I think, right now, based on all of the data that we're seeing, is about 312 for Donald Trump and 226 for Kamala Harris. Again, it's all dependent upon a lot of things happening between now and Election Day. Michigan, going to be tight. North Carolina, going to be tight. So, entirely possible that this ends up being the outcome, 281 to 257. So you can go out into RCP and do your own, do your own little map here if you want to. But I would say, based upon the most recent data that we're kind of seeing right now, that this is going to be the most probable outcome that we're going to see. Now, how does this ultimately influence other areas or other directions, I guess you could say, other, prognosticators? Well, we have this thing out here called Polymarket. I'm just going to go ahead and refresh the screen just so I know that I've got the most recent, and I do. So right now, Polymarket has the odds of Trump winning the election at 66.8 and Kamala Harris at 33.3. So it's basically he's basically doubled what they're predicting for Harris here, and she's moving down and he's moving up. So I think that if we were to interpret this, there's a feeling that there's a lot of momentum that is helping to push Trump along. However, these states are not shaded dark red. So till I see dark red on these, I'm not going to celebrate. I'll be real, and that'll be on election day. But you can see, really, things began to cross for Harris early in October, which is exactly around the time that we started to see things for Harris collapse, or start to collapse anyways, on the RCP average. And ever since then, direction has been moving more favorable towards Trump. Now, we're still a long way off from being able to call this a Trump victory, but Arizona, Polymarket, odds 74% Trump. Georgia, about the same roughly for Trump. Nevada, about 66% Trump. Pennsylvania, 62% Trump. Wisconsin, 59% Trump. Michigan, 53% Trump. You see where we're going here? 48%, or 42% rather, for Trump on the popular vote odds, and 58%. So most likely they're predicting that Harris will have the popular vote. Don't know, it could be by just a few votes, or it could be by more, I don't know. But basically by some margin, they're predicting that she will end up carrying the popular and Trump will end up still carrying the electoral college, which is ultimately where it matters the most. Now, they don't show North Carolina on here. I don't know why they don't have that on here as one of the top swing states, but obviously it is. Maybe they're just not concerned about it a whole lot. Let's just look on it here. So North Carolina, all right, here we go. They're putting the odds here around 73%. That's I would say, very generous in my opinion, but still doable. Time will tell. So right now, I would say if you are a Trump supporter, you are in a pretty good position right now. Definitely get your vote in. Help others get their vote in. Bring people to the polls. Do not assume that this election is in the bag. Yeah, we can certainly say that it's possible that we're slightly ahead, but we got to, as they say, play like we are about 2 points behind. So I think that's the wise bet right now is the prudent decision, the prudent action is to act as though we are behind and pray that we are further ahead than what we really are. We know that there were some shenanigans pulled last election cycle, as they usually are. We are always told that these things don't matter, though. We're told that it doesn't matter how many times you see someone in the newspaper for some type of an election fraud of doing something that they're not supposed to do, that it really doesn't matter. It doesn't have much of an influence or impact on elections. I don't believe that. The reality is that we do need mechanisms to ensure that the votes are legitimate whenever they are cast. And there are a lot of lawsuits that are being filed right now in places around the country. I know that in Virginia there were about 1,500 registrants who admitted to being illegal aliens whenever they got their driver's license, and yet they still registered to vote. So explain that one. They went in, get their driver's license, registered to vote. They admit to being here illegally, and the governor's office said, "Hey, we got to do something about that." And so he moved to purge those from the voter rolls. And I think it was the state Supreme Court or one of the courts, anyways, that essentially said, "Sorry, you can't do that." I mean, well, Why not? Why is it that we can't remove people who are not legitimately allowed to vote from the voter rolls? So that's just that doesn't make sense, obviously. And there are all sorts of lawsuits being filed right now. It's crazy that we have to do this every single election cycle, but it's been this way for a while, for about 24 years, ever since about 2000, and it seems to be getting worse sometimes rather than better. And I pray that we can get a handle on this, that we can get some security into the election process, or at least the perception of security, to where we feel that the elections are indeed legitimate. And what I mean by that is that the person who's casting the vote is alive, a legal citizen of the state in which they are voting, all right, and properly registered, and the individual, the individual that they are claiming to be. That's pretty simple. And to do that, all it takes is some voter ID and some good processes to make sure that people who are voting are indeed legally allowed to do so. That's it. That's all we care about. However the chips may fall is how they fall. But they need to be legitimate. We can't have counterfeit counterfeit votes, basically diluting the votes of actual people who should be voting. Hope you've enjoyed this first edition, or this first episode, or broadcast, however you want to call it, podcast for the Matt Hatter Show. We will be doing some additional breakdowns and analyses over the next week for the election. So stay tuned, and we will catch you next time. Thanks again.